won't take up too much of your time. We just thought it'd be very informative for you to get a further insight into Ed Moses' works by none other than Dr. Richard Davey, who is a senior researcher at Nottingham Trent University, and who was also a close friend of the artist Ed Moses, whose works you're amongst tonight. First of all, welcome to JD Malat Gallery. So this is Ed Moses' exhibition at the gallery. It's called California Cool, and it opened today at the gallery. The works flew in just last week. So Richard is joining me tonight to give us a little bit more insight into Ed Moses' practice, and he was a close friend of Ed Moses and was lucky enough to see him in the studio in action. And so I thought it would be very interesting for him to tell us more about his technique and about his process and about the ideas behind this exhibition, and in particular the title California Cool, which you're probably all wondering about. So first of all, Rich, can you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about your relationship with the artist Ed?
So, as Victoria said, I am a senior research fellow at Nottingham Trent University as part of my time. And in that I write about contemporary artists. I've written books for the Royal Academy of Arts on Anselm Kiefer, for the summer exhibition and some of the other Royal Academy missions. And as part of that, I've known Christopher Lebrun, who was the previous president of the Royal Academy, for a number of years. And his dealer in New York was also Ed Moses' dealer. And he asked if I was saying I'd like to do a show with Christopher Lebrun, and in his gallery in New York, and one or two other artists. And he said, would you put Ed Moses in? And I, at that time, kind of knew the name but didn't really know him. And I said, yes, as long as I get a free trip to California, to LA, to go and visit Ed. And he said, okay, we can organise that. So I went, and it was just before Ed died, a few weeks before he died. And I was told Ed might give you an hour or two. And 3 days later, we hadn't stopped talking, and his personal assistant said, I've not seen him talk like that with somebody about his art for decades. He really connected with you. So I felt very, very close to Ed, but it was just over 3 days. The what's happened since is that when Ed died, the estate wanted a book written about him. Because the gallery in New York knew me and my writing, and they'd seen me working with Ed, they said, would you write the book? And what's happened in the subsequent 4 or 5 years of going to live in his house, spending weeks on end in his house, looking through every single work that they have there, and talking to most of his friends still alive, I feel as though I have become a really close friend, as his son says, Andy, who's going to be showing later in the gallery. You know my dad as well as even some of his oldest friends, because of that kind of process of getting to know him, getting under his skin.
It's a nice story, yeah. Really nice. So how would you describe this exhibition and situate it within Ed's whole
So, for those who don't know Ed, and Ed is very well known. If you go to LA, the name Ed Moses he is one of the most important artists in LA, but he hasn't really travelled. He spent some time in New York when in the late 1950s, he spent just under a year living in New York. He lived in the same apartment block as Agnes Martin. He knew most of the abstract expressionists. He was part of that school, but he didn't quite fit in, and he wanted to go back to LA. And in a sense, this show, although it's 60 years after that time, captures what he was doing at the very beginning of his kind of working career. Because he's obsessed with two things. He's obsessed with the void, and is obsessed with order. And he calls it at times chance and circumstance, but that, as I found out later, everybody thought, oh, Ed's come up with this. It's actually a name of a book which he's got in his library about John Cage and Merce Cunningham, the choreographer. So he, as he always did, he would nick things which seemed to work and capture something about himself, and he'd borrow it and then make it his own. But he was obsessed with two artists, and if you look at the show, you'll see them. He's obsessed with Mondrian, which you have on this side, but he's flipped it. But underneath, you'll see Mondrian's grids. You'll see in some of these works, you'll see little crosses. This is Mondrian's grids. And on this side, you've got Pollock. And it's the freedom of Pollock versus the order of the grid. And this show captures it just perfectly. It's what he was doing from, not quite the early 1950s when he was a student at UCLA, but pretty much from the very beginning he was obsessed with order and the grid and chaos. Ed was born in 1926. He had quite a difficult childhood. His mother was, we'd now look back and say, quite abusive, mentally abusive. And he had two older brothers who both died when they were children. And that kind of weighed on him. When he was 17, 2 days before, a week before his birthday, he enrolled in the US Navy. This was 1943. He enrolled in the US Navy. He did all the tests, and he was put into the US Navy Surgical Corps and went down to San Diego. And in San Diego, he was treating Marines who were coming off Guadalcanal and all the horrific Japanese, the Second World War. And he was a petty officer, third class. He was a surgeon's assistant, and he was dealing with death.
Wow.
And that's what you see on this side, is something about death, about the void, about the body. And you see these amazing colours here. He's got an instinctive colorist aesthetic, but it's more about Kilroy was here. It's him making a mark. That he painted until he died because he needed. Painting was a way for him to say, I am still alive, I am a body in this world. And that's what you're seeing here. It's Pollock, but it's not Pollock. It's not the looseness of Pollock. It's not the chaos of Pollock. He's in putting order into it, because it's him moving a brush across a canvas. Often it's a domestic brush. If you want to see the equivalent of these works, you need to go to Howes and Worth and see the Ed Clark exhibition, which is on, where he was a few decades before working with a broom. And that's what Ed was doing a bit later. But he was doing it not much after Ed Clark. So these are action paintings. These are about the body, embodiment. This is embodied art, action art, rather than just nice colours or pure kind of chaos.
Really interesting. Wow. So in terms of the title, California Cool, can you explain a little bit more about that? And then in previous conversations we've had, you alluded a little to Ed's personality. So can you perhaps explain how California Cool ties in with his own personality? So
Ed, part of the problem with the California Cool title is for some people, it take you back to, and it alludes in the title, to the Cool School, which is a group of artists around the Ferris Gallery, which was it lasted for about 10 years or just under in La Cienega Boulevard, and it was where Ed Ruscha, Larry Bell, Ed Kienholz, Craig Hoffman, Billy Al Bankston, Ed Moses, Wally Berman, they were the core of this gallery. But this gallery also showed towards towards the latter end, the gallery got taken on by a curator called Irving Blum, who were then brought in. So the first show of Andy Warhol's Campbell soup tins was shown at Ferris. You had Joseph Alba's Homage to the Square. Roy Lichtenstein was showing at Ferris. So there was this school and this kind of idea of these cool artists. But for me, what the cool school captures is the dichotomy that was going on. And if you talk to any of the artists in LA of that generation, it really was a big thing to them that they were looked down on by New York artists. New York artists said, these California, these LA artists, they're all about surfing and women. Now it's very true. They didn't all surf. They were all into women. They were, Ed Moses would turn up when he was later in life after his divorce. He would turn up at a gallery with a girlfriend. He'd already told one girlfriend to be at the gallery before him. He'd meet up. He probably had three women he was dating at the same time in a private view. He was absolutely. One of the people I had to interview was Angelica Houston, who was one of his closest friends. When he was dying, she would go every week to read to him. So he was part of the Hollywood. His friends dated Hollywood starlets. He'd got married by that point, but he hung out with Dennis Hopper. Dennis Hopper and he broke into the Ferris Gallery. So there's a sense that he was part of that Hollywood, that some of those LA artists, they hung out with Hollywood artists. One of his closest friends is Frank Gehry, the architect. Yeah. So it's that kind of sense of the cool. But the other thing is the lifestyle that a lot of the Californian artists, unlike the New York artists or the East Coast, who would go to every private view and would read the reviews and want to make sure that they did something brand new. These guys weren't obsessed in that way. They just made work because they loved making work. They weren't bothered by, am I part of a school? So that's why it's not quite a cool school. It's what you put, a California cool. It's just, they chill out. They make work. The most important thing in their life is making work. But then at the end of the day, if they go to private views, Ed was famous for having the strongest marijuana and smoking it after work. Never during that. But he smoked it in the sense it was medicinal. He was told by a close friend of his, Tony Bellant, who said to him, look, you are too wound up, Ed. Ed was terrified of death, as I said earlier. He was terrified he just was on edge all the time. And Tony said, you've got to smoke dope. Don't drink and listen to jazz as the beats were doing. Smoke dope, that'll take the edge off. And it worked for him. But it was more than the medicinal taking the edge off. The other thing he was obsessed by was the idea of the unconscious mind. Yeah. And he was fascinated. He took a trip with Frank Gehry, and I can't remember, there was another of that group, to the Lascaux Caves to see the early cave art. And again, this is all about cave art. This is about making a mark, putting your, getting pigment, ochre in your mouth, getting spit. And then, if you go, there are these amazing handprints. That's the thing Ed got drawn to, where you'd spit and make a handprint. And Ed had a collection of Stone Age Neolithic axe heads and arrows in his house. And he was fascinated. He had a book about primitive Paleolithic art. And it's that as well. When he smoked, he'd work in the day. He then would have a smoke, and he'd invite friends around to have a smoke with him, to then talk about the work. So he could look at the work without his conscious mind. So he could look at this and say, what's going on here? Without his conscious mind saying, criticizing and saying, that brushstroke's wrong. It's saying, where does this take me? Where in this universe am I? So in that sense, it's also about that sense of cool, of just kind of not being obsessed, of letting go, of not being obsessed with the kind of going into very narrow ways of thinking.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Okay, so how do you feel that Ed's works situate within the history of art? So you've talked about the Cool School, you've talked about Jackson Pollock, Mondrian as his influences. In the sort of greater scheme of things, how do you feel that Ed Moses fits into the history of art? And why do you think his art is so relevant today?
An interesting thing about Ed is that he's often misunderstood, and he's called a great abstract expressionist. Ed wasn't, and he never called himself an abstract expressionist. He was looking at, there's lots of work which is figurative. This isn't, obviously, but there was little figurative elements. It's all about the body, so it's about the body rather than just abstract ideas. It's about how do I express the body. And
But his
own body, and then it's that haptic kind of response of the viewer. Kind of, to me, I look at these and I want to I can imagine it's like an ice cream. I can imagine licking that ice cream, plunging in or swimming in, that sense of response. But where's he fit? I've talked about Ed Clark. I think he had books and books about Gerhard Richter and Gerhard Richter's Smeared. You can place that, but he's not copying. From the very beginning, he was always looking. In a sense, the world he looked at wasn't the world out there, it was the world in his mind and the world of art. So he's constantly looking at artists and saying, wow, how did they make that mark? Right, I can do it better. How do I do it better? How do I make my own impact on this world? How do I respond to what these people are doing? So for me, this is Gerhard Richter, it's Ed Clark, it's any number, it's Mondrian, it's any number of artists working with grids and these things. But it's Ed saying, I can do this differently, I can do this better. So it's constantly responding to the history of art, but saying, I don't want to be part of that history. I'm not about fitting into a particular school, it's about here are people that are making marks like me, and I want to make my own marks, and I want to. So I think in some ways he doesn't fit into art history because he's not trying to be in art history. He's California rather than New York. He's mark making rather than looking at the reviews, looking at what's being said, what's being written, and responding to that. He's responding to what does my body do? What do I do with my hand as I'm drawing with a pencil? What do I do when I move a brush across the surface of a canvas? So I think that's really important because sometimes we can get so obsessed with where's this fit within history of art that we stop to look at what he's doing and how we respond. I look at these works and I go, I'm looking at a human being saying I am here. And pushing and making me feel something. It doesn't need to be it's about how do I move through space. And the thing with Ed, he swore at me when I was talking to him once, because I said, because the show, early on, I was saying the show I wanted to do was about space, and about how we go in, we kind of, this internal space, the kind of looking in perspective, and he said, that's absolutely fucking rubbish, Richard, it's nothing to do with that. It's about one mark on top of another. And when you start to look at Ed in that way, that's exactly what Ed's doing. He's making one mark on top of another. Every breath he takes, he's making a mark. He was a Buddhist, and that's really important when you see this work. That it's about the present moment leading to the next present moment, leading to the next present moment. And there's some work, these three here, if you look at them, you see little ovals. And those ovals remind me of some works. He got two big studios. And so if you went to visit Ed, he lives in Venice. He's lived in Venice for most of his life. He painted outside, and then he'd take the work inside. And there was a series of two lots of paintings which he did almost just some of the last, at the same time as these. Some of them, what he did, he had a friend who was a set design painter for Hollywood, and he told Ed about crackle paint, which is how you get crackles age furniture. And so it's got polymer layer. Now, he called it his secret sauce, but basically it kind of allows the outer layer of the paint to dry at a different speed to the back layer of the paint. And he found that he punched it one day. Now, there's various popular stories as to whether he slipped and fell or deliberately did it, but he punched it, and it suddenly created a rose, which related to some earlier drawings he did in the early 1960s. And he loved this. And he created these grids of these roses, which are basically his fist punching. And it's that last mark. And then he got mirrors, and he created these mirrored paintings. But on them are these stones, which he picked up, and he painted the surface of the stones, like children paint stones, and he stuck them onto the surface as a grid. And it's that last physical thing of, here is the painting finished. And to me, those ovals are those stones of these mirrored paintings, where we look into the painting as though it's taking us inwards, this illusionary space of perspective. But actually, it's about the painting, each layer of paint moving out towards us. Each last moment coming out towards us with those ovals about stones just telling us this is the last moment, this is physicality.
Okay, really interesting, thank you. So my final question was, if Ed was still alive today, what direction do you think his art would be going?
I think he would be...
Or do you think he did it all? Or do you think he achieved everything?
I think he just kept making marks, so I don't know where he'd go. It depends. He was constantly looking at younger artists, even the young LA artists who'd be always going to their private views, and they were so desperate that Ed would go to their private views, and he would. I think he towards the end of his life, the last year or so, he was in a wheelchair, and there's some works which we haven't got here, and I don't know whether they've been kept. I think they have, where he just got the wheelchair, went across the canvas with the wheelchair, did kind of almost wheelies, and so you have the wheelchair marks on these canvases. I think you'd get more of those, where he would have made a painting and then he'd have left it wet and he'd have been rummaging around with his wheelchair. But even at the end, when I was with him, he was still making marks with the paintbrush, doing that. Making those final marks. So I think he would have just been still making a mark.
Absolutely.
What it was,
do you think that, it just something came to mind whilst we were speaking earlier, would you qualify his art as almost performance art in that way?
I think there are times, towards the end particularly, where there's a degree of action, performance, and you look at him, there are videos of him painting, and he's definitely aware of it. There's performance, there's a series of works he did, some of the most famous, where he really got recognition. He got recognition a bit later than some of his contemporaries in the Ferris Gallery. And what he did was he made these what are called resin works, and they're not many of them left because they're so fragile, but they relate to some of the fetish finish works of the 60s and 70s Californian painters. And there were two things. So he got this canvas, and he'd make marks, and there'd be paint on the surface of where he was painting, and the canvas would take that. But he'd get what's called, basically it's a whip line. So it's what builders use to create a mark, a straight line when they're, on the floor. So it's a piece of string tied between two bricks, and you cover it in pigment, and then you flip it. You can't flick it, and it leaves a line of pigment on on a floor. He was doing this on the canvas, and these relate to Navajo rugs. And a friend of his had got got a photograph, passport photograph, which he'd put in one of these cellophane, kind of these early laminate kind of, squashed it so it was laminated. He loved that, and he wanted to recreate it. So he then covered these canvases in resin, which contain these whip lines. So I think those whip lines to me are action, performance painting. These are kind of performance painting. But he was brush. There needs to be the connection between his arm, his mind, his arm, his hand, the brush, the paint, the canvas. That connection, that link. Yeah. I would say was incredibly important. It wasn't, as I said, it's not Pollock, flicking and kind of
it wasn't
haphazard. Random. It's not random. It's he's moving it. He's deliberately.
Absolutely, really interesting. Fantastic. Well, I certainly found that really interesting. I hope that you did as well.